Hello, my name is Tamsin Peach and welcome to another episode of History Lab Live, where we bring you recordings of conversations about Australian history happening in bookshops, universities and public venues across the country. In this episode, we bring you an in-depth discussion about the joys and challenges of bringing Australian history to a television audience. Writer and academic Julianne Schultz worked with director Benjamin Jones and producer Darren Dale to translate her book, The Idea of Australia, to the small screen. They speak about how the filmmakers sought to capture the attention of the TikTok generation in a show that mines Australia's screen archives to help raise complex and sometimes painful questions about our past and our future. If you haven't seen it yet, you can still watch the 4-part series hosted by actor Rachel Griffiths on SBS On Demand. This episode is brought to you in partnership with Gleebooks, which hosted this live conversation led by the ABC's Cassie McCullough in spring of 2025.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gleebooks. It's such a pleasure to have you here. I'm Sunil. I'm the events manager here at Gleebooks. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to celebrate The Idea of Australia by Julianne Schultz. I'd now like to introduce all of our speakers tonight. Professor Emeritus Julianne Schultz, AM, FAHA, is the chair of the conversation. She was the publisher and founding editor of the Griffiths Review and is the Professor Emeritus of Media and Culture at Griffiths Centre for Social and Cultural Research and a member of the board of the Sydney Writers' Festival. She's an acclaimed author of several books, including Reviving the Fourth Estate, Steel City Blues, and the librettos to the award-winning operas Black River and Going Into Shadows. In 2009, she became a member of the Order of Australia for services to journalism and the community and an honorary fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities the following year. Whether it's epic stories of national identity, personal journeys examining the human condition, or a cooking series with a local icon, director Benjamin Jones brings a sense of humour and an exacting eye for art direction to every story he tells. Credits include co-directing and editing the AFI-nominated documentary Rudely Interrupted for the ABC, producing and post-producing on the ACTA-nominated series Judith Lucy is All Woman, directing on America's Health Revolution with Michael Mosley for SBS, and many more shows, including directing on the global hit food series for Disney Plus, Donna Hay Christmas. Producer Darren Dale has been a company director at Blackfella Films, Australia's premier First Nations production company since 2000. In 2008, Darren, together with Rachel Perkins, produced the landmark multi-platform history series First Australians for SBS. And Cassie McCullough, if you're a book lover, you'll know who she is. She's a presenter, journalist and writer. Since joining the ABC in 2007, she's presented and produced a wide range of programs for Radio National, local radio and ABC Classic. Most recently, she presented RN's flagship social affairs program, Life Matters, and popular culture programs, TV Club and The List, as well as presenting Best of the Festivals and reporting for Books and Arts. With Kate Evans, she co-hosts RN's The Bookshelf, an hour-long program discussing latest literary fiction releases with writers, critics, publishers and industry insiders. And I hope you will all welcome these wonderful speakers now, please.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Who here has seen the television adaptation of Julianne's book? Who here is in the TV adaptation of Julianne's book? I guess also many of us will have read this book. I had the pleasure of reading it back in 2022 in March, and I interviewed Julianne on the radio about it, and I was so struck by the ideas in it. I felt I was reading something truly fresh, and I think that's what this team here must have felt when they first looked at it too, because how on earth were you crazy enough to try to translate it to the screen? How about you answer that one, Darren Dale?
Julianne and I had known each other for a period of time, nearly probably a decade, Julianne, or longer, through being on a board together. And really the conversation about exploring the idea of Australia and what was our place in it, we'd started that conversation together privately over some time. And so it was all when Julianne then was launching the book, I'd read the book and thought, God, this distillation of some of the issues that confront us and where we might go. And that was the important thing for me in a world where ideas seem more bankrupt and less out there, or the ability to make them for the screen. I pestered the SBS managing director a lot, and he was very good and said, okay, well, look, you've pitched this show so many times. Actually, why don't you just bloody make it? So sometimes persistence is good. And I don't know that Julianne thought, we would really get to make it. But look, big shout out to SBS really, because as a place that really champions ideas, I think they become even more important now, because the sorts of stories that we get to make for television, I think you'll see, are getting more and more difficult to do complex ideas. I think to talk about complex work.
It is complex, but it doesn't feel complex when you're watching it. And that's just a masterstroke on the behalf of the creative team. And I'm including you in that, Benjamin, because what you've done visually is extraordinary in breaking down complex ideas about nationhood and more, and mixing them up with pop culture and humour, and also making us feel engaged, but also a little uncertain of what we're seeing, which is so thrilling and exciting. Julianne, when you wrote this, even the idea of Australia as a title is bold. Where was the kernel?
Look, I'd had the idea for quite a long time, because I thought what I'd observed over many years, and particularly during the years that I was editing Griffith's Review, and I'd do, we did the 4 thematic editions each year, and we'd do lots of events like this. And occasionally we'd do sort of very Australian-centred editions. And what I found in the response to all of them, people coming up and saying, I feel lost. I don't feel like I've got my bearings in this country anymore. I don't feel like there's an openness for a discussion about where we might go. It was as though the John Howard line when he became Prime Minister, and he said, we're sick of endless seminars about Australian identity, had been absorbed, and it had just become something that was, on one hand, was the captive of what I describe as the oi brigade, who had an old, very inward-looking notion of what being Australian meant on that hand, and on the other, it had been reduced to advertising slogans, so it was the beer ads or the, whatever the products were, and so there wasn't much space for people to comfortably have more complex discussions. So I guess that was really the genesis for it. And I kept on talking to Jane Novak, my agent, off and on about it. And she said, you've got to do this, you've got to do it. And then when COVID happened, she said, well, now you've really got to do it, because you can't go to meetings, you can't get on a plane, you've just got to sit in your house and do this. And so that was sort of really the genesis of it. And the interesting thing was that, of course, it's not about COVID, but COVID provided a brilliant way of providing an X-ray, because the strengths and weaknesses of the society became very apparent during that period.
Yes, it revealed a lot about ourselves to ourselves. Let me just sort of précis for people, what happens in the first few minutes of this. I've tried to do it. Look at my professional attempt here. We learn that Australia, is this great multicultural success story, but not for Indigenous Australians. It's the place of the fair go, but not for First People and, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is Rachel Perkins tells us this. Then Jennifer Robinson tells us it's also not great for a gender pay gap, although there are incredible freedoms for women. Marshall Langton describes the so-called empty land, the terra nullius, as actually a pretty well-organised place with a lot of people in it, and who'd been there for 65,000 years or more, and hundreds of thousands of people, getting along pretty well in a complex and organised series of cultures. Melissa Lukashenko also puts her voice in there. And we get Tony Moore tells us about forced migration of dispossessed people from Great Britain and Ireland becoming involuntary agents of colonising this country. And Rachel Griffiths follows up by telling us that the hero white settlers were actually drenched in blood. It's an extraordinary series of paradoxes and contradictions. These are big ideas. I mean, I know it's hard for artists like yourselves to sort of narrow this down to a single idea, but was it those contradictions that you wanted to really put out front in your opening argument?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why I led so heavily on popular culture as our way to let people in. These are big, scary ideas to a lot of people, and there's the danger that they're threatening and will push people away rather than engage. So I thought the safest way to invite people in was through art and through popular culture, things that they're already familiar with and that might open their minds a little bit and make them feel safe, that it's okay, come in, we're going to have a big chat. And you're going to understand it, and it's going to make sense to you too.
Yes, because we might go from Australia's extraordinary voting system to a clip of Bluey, and yeah.
Well, it helps. I think it helps to have a bit of Kath and Kim when you're going to talk about neoliberalism. So that was the thinking behind that.
Are you saying we're affluent?
It's one of my favourite clips of all time.
I think the Price is Right clip is pretty good too.
Yeah.
I think these ideas are scary actually, and they're polarizing, and I think what the series does is allows us to have a discussion, and the show itself is having a discussion with itself. And I think the importance of that, like I know from my filmmaking career, because, how do you approach these things? I think making First Australians felt terrifying. And I remember Marcia Langton in making that story. Marcia said to us, because we were grappling with how do we make it? Like, how do we put that show together? Do we do a chronology, or do we do it like center it more from an Indigenous perspective and do a thing about law, LORE, and do we do about religion and try and frame that series? And actually we met Ken Burns, the greatest American documentary maker, and he said, a story starts here and it goes there. Why are you trying to complicate it? So then Rachel and I we'd written these scripts and spent a long time and speaking to Henry Reynolds. But Marcia was great, actually. She said this very instructive thing to me when I was like 25. And she said, you have to include white people in this story, and you have to make the story as much about them or people that challenge your ideas, because otherwise you'll do to them what was done to us. And I remember hearing that and going, oh my God, of course we can have the great work of Henry Reynolds. Of course we can have all of these other great academics who have spent a long time inhabiting these works. And I guess what I'm leading to is that, the great thing that Ben did and with Julianne and the team did is, like, there's over 65 interviewees in the series, and some people have said it feels frenetic, but I think to have that diversely populated voices, I think makes it richer and allows us to sort of discuss the ideas in the show.
Well, it also has a pace that many young Australians are more used to as a form of information than we perhaps are, and that's part of, I think, its genius and the key to its longevity. Do you think it might end up in schools? Actually even more interesting.
I hope so. I'd love for this to be a way in for a younger generation to look at Australia, or even new Australians as well, people who've just come here who are trying to wrap their hands around what is this nation beyond the cliches. And again, to me, it's through popular culture, and art is the way in. Like, you go to another country on holidays, you go to their galleries, that's how you see who these people are. So to me, it's a way to do it without having to explain everything as well. Like, in one image, you can say so much. And it's also a bit of a break from the 65 talking heads as well.
And it's not a hectoring sort of, sit down and listen to this and we're going to take you through chronologically. It's obviously it's very thematic, but that use of the pop culture stuff and the visual art material with the seriousness of the academics and others is to just make it very much more accessible. I mean, I've taken to calling it history for the TikTok generation, and I think there's something about that speed of it which some viewers find more difficult to accommodate because they were expecting to be more explanatory than it is. Whereas, I mean, and this is the thing that both Darren and Ben have worked with so much is, that television works. It deals with information, but it works at an emotional level. So having to get the triggers that provide the emotional level, and to do that in a shorthand, which you can do by having the Bluey grab or the affluent grab or whatever it is one, is something that you need to break, to not to undermine what the academics and other experts are saying, but just to make it accessible. It's sort of a different part of the brain.
And television, it does a very good job at images and emotion, I think. But what it doesn't, in our experience, is it doesn't deal with complexity terribly well. It's hard to get deep, complex thoughts and to try and keep it going because it either needs lots of explanation, which audiences then say, oh, that was too long and boring or feels worthy. So I think television, that is its big challenge. And I think, Julianne, you can probably talk to that, it's been an interesting process along the way of, we must have that in, or we must have that in, or if you don't know that, you won't be able to follow that. And I think...
And I say, you can't have that sentence without having this I lost a lot of those, which is fair enough. But I actually, in a funny way, I mean, you're talking about the first episode, which has got that fair go notion, which is the really, if you look at the sort of research on Australian values, I mean, Australian values are so middle of the road, there is actually very little that stand out with other comparable countries. But this notion of fairness it spikes as something which is particularly distinctive in the Australian sort of psyche. And so when we were working it up, and the idea of the fair go was Jacob, the other producer's very strong idea that that's where we needed to start. And I remember Darren coming into the meeting and say, well, there are a lot of people it's not very fair for, mate. and so that dialectic in a way was really there very strongly. But I realised just in hearing people's response to it that I'm reminded I've got a 3.5-year-old granddaughter who's into the puzzle phase of being a 3.5-year-old. She loves puzzles. And I was doing them with her the other day and she said, look, Yaya, you've got to understand, you've got to get the corners right. When you get the corners right, that you can fill in the rest. And it feels to me that Fair Go-ish episode is in a way about framing the corners of what we're doing.
Yeah, it's certainly a theme that follows through. And towards the end, we hear about the way mining and resource extraction has become, one of the most problematic parts of our wealth and lack of wealth. We don't have a sovereign wealth fund. There was no agreement in the main with people who actually owned the land for that to happen. And so we're hearing about that. And then suddenly we get the sale of the century. Actually, it is Tony Barber, and that to me conveyed all of that so quickly and so wonderfully. And it doesn't matter if a TikTok generation kid doesn't understand that. I got it, so that was great. So I want to know a little bit about how you managed to 65 interviewees, incredible. When you invited people to be part of this conversation, what was the offer you extended to them? What did you put, how did you get them across the line, or was it easy?
Marianne Leach and Fatini are here in the room who were doing all that hard work of ringing people up and talking to people and, explaining why it was important for them to be there. I mean, the interviewees break into a number of categories. So there's quite a number of historians. We had a preference for women historians, just being a bit perverse. And so I guess the process was trying to break down the beats of the thing and then to try and find people who were expert in the areas who could talk about it. There was material which had been published since I finished the book. I mean, the whole story about Baron Field, the Chief Justice of New South Wales, who's the first person who uses terra nullius as the description of the continent, was work that was done by Justin Clemens and Tom Ford in Melbourne. It was a book that was published by Melbourne University Press. Got almost no attention. But you've got a guy called Baron Field, for Christ's sake, defining terra nullius as a country. I mean, it's just too good to actually let go. So,
and also the man who rhymed Australia with failure.
And so you sort of think,
so good.
That was a gift, the whole thing.
And he's the guy who puts up the first plaque to Captain Cook. It is truly bizarre. But I guess one of the things that I was very conscious of in working with Marianne and Fatini, particularly in identifying who would be the experts that we used, was that I wanted it to be accessible to people who don't know much, which we are told in all the polls is a large number of the proportion of the population. But I also wanted people who know a lot to come away with something that they didn't necessarily know before, so that there was a sort of a reward in that for them as well. And that was really an important element that goes all the way through. So there's the experts, then there's the public figures, pop culture people, who, just to give it a bit more engagement with people, they know these figures and they say something. But then the other really important element, which goes all the way through, and Fatini is really was a crucial person in this, is the very emotional family stories. while we've skated over a lot of stuff and we've made it as accessible as possible with, Ben's brilliant, culling of the archive, the crucial other bit was to tell very moving stories of people's personal experience. So there was a core of real emotional depth. So in that first episode, the story of Brian Cortis up near Bundaberg, who lives on a farm that his grandfather bought from one of the slave traders of the islanders. And his grandfather had said to him, there are people who died here working here. And when he eventually retired, he said, I'm going to find these bodies. And he gets the infrared machine out and discovers 28 bodies of people who've died on the property. He then goes through this extraordinary process with the Queensland government to actually create an official cemetery for the people who died there on his property, which is then open, but with the, all the sort of diplomatic corps of people who've come from all the South Pacific Islands where these people were brought from. Now, that's an amazing story. Like in country Australia, there is somebody doing this work and memorialising something which is, generally not known. Michael Wesley, who people here probably know, is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Melbourne. His mother was Australian. His father was a very great Indian artist. She could not get permission from the Australian High Commission in Delhi to come back to Australia because she was married to a brown man and had brown babies. And she'd go to the New Delhi High Commission year after year asking for permission. And then she'd go back and they'd say, oh, we've lost your application. He'd do it again. So it took until Whitlam finally abolishing, the end of the sort of White Australia policy for Michael's mother to get a message from her family in Adelaide saying, go back to the embassy, to the High Commission, we think you can get in. They get in, they come here. And then the other one, of course, in that first episode was Yasmin Abdul-Majid's mother, Faiza, who's a brilliant woman, talking about the toll that the harassment of Yasmin took on their family and the conditional place for people who've come from elsewhere and not, seem to be accepted, but then they step over a line. So they were just three of the examples of those family stories. I mean, Ben particularly loves the Johnny Lovett story of the soldiers in Western Victoria.
Yeah, in episode 2, that was a beautiful story. And also, again, the first thing I always do, and especially when it's a big history, is to think of what you said. What are the stories that are going to connect with people? Like, what am I going to feel in this? And so Fatini and Marianne did such an amazing job of getting us these people who told us extraordinary stories.
Remind us of that story.
He's been fighting for his family's land that was taken from them to give to soldier settlers as part of the soldier settler scheme. So his father was one of 5 brothers who all 5 of them fought in World War I, World War II, all the way through to Afghanistan, I believe. And as a result of the soldier settlement scheme, his father was removed from the land and that was given to soldier settlers. And so First Nations people weren't allowed to be part of soldier settler scheme. So he's been fighting for his father to get his land back for the last 50 years, I guess.
And he tells a story at the end, which is that, he's been, very actively involved in this campaign for, his whole lifetime. And then in Victoria, they've got this weird thing of painting wheat silos and stuff. I guess you're familiar with this. It's very, very, very Victorian. My grandfather was involved in building silos, and our childhood was spent looking at that. Look, Grandpa built that silo. Now they're all being painted. They're much more interesting than they once were. But Johnny says they painted the pictures of his 4 uncles and his father and his 4 uncles on the silo in this town in Western Victoria, and said, and that's the best you can do, So it's that sort of mix of intimate personal stuff. And one of the other sort of things which I don't think was by design necessarily, just as the strong female experts wasn't necessarily by design, most of the emotional stories are told by men. So John Fairfax tells the story of 7 Shillings Beach here in the eastern suburbs and talks about his father Vincent Fairfax telling him the story of why 7 Shillings Beach was called 7 Shillings Beach as the money that was given to the Aboriginal people who lived on the beach as go-away money. So I think having somebody of that sort of stature telling that story gives it an extra sort of resonance.
Which is important because it wasn't actually sold. He didn't get recompense for the land that was taken from him and his people. He was just given it to go away. And then there's a very, very tragic little sting in the tail of that story as well.
That apparently when his wife died, when the Garra's wife died, he was buried. He buried her with the 7 shillings. So, which sort of said everything you need to know, really. And interesting, John Fairfax, his very patrician Sydney establishment family, actually absolutely engages with that story. He says, I understand that, we made a mistake. So I just think it's just trying to say that it's not politically correct. It's not only some people think like this and others. We've not been good in this country at telling those stories across generations. We know in relation to First Nations people that those stories weren't tied, and that recapturing of that storyline has been so crucial in the last couple of decades. But what's interesting, it seems to me, is that for people who came as immigrants, especially in the sort of post-war period, they were told, don't talk about where you've come from. So those stories, there was a break in those stories, and those of us who'd been here for multi-generations also got out of the habit of telling the stories. And so it's like this sort of everyone comes as this blank slate that they can rediscover. And so I was just really, I think part of the motivation that we all had was to try and fill in the jigsaw a bit, give that texture a bit.
And I think you're absolutely right. Like having the contemporary voices that have some connection to the past or have a connection to the history. I remember in First Australians when we spoke to the white farmer who almost became more of a celebrity out of your First Australians, really, when he was talking about Windradine and the move over and recognising Windradine's grave. And then even in the Australian Wars, you look at the Tasmanian descendants, people who are hanging on to their identity, rebuilding and reshaping what it means to be Tasmanian Aboriginal person. I think those parts are so moving to us because you see people grappling with the history or the effects of, what's happened in the past. And I think all those people have been very generous to come on screen and tell those stories. But I think, if we can open ourselves up to have those conversations more broadly and engender people to speak about those things, I think that is where the exciting bit for me is, where the ideas can be talked about, in a broader sense, not just limited to a show or a book. I think that's what one of the aims of all the work that we try and do is.
Yes, well, the power of storytelling, whether it's a painting on a cave wall or something that's on TikTok, it's all part of one big thing, and we are forgetting things. And I was interested recently to hear an interview with one of the creators of the 2 musicals about Phar Lap that are out this month. She was saying that a young person she was speaking to asked her what she was doing, and she said, I'm making this musical about Phar Lap, and they said, who's that? Not that it matters that we had the greatest horse of all time, but how does that just slip from cultural memory? That's why these discussions are so important. And in fact, one of the moments that moved me very much was, and I'm not sure now which episode it was in, but the series of Australian prime ministers, Labor prime ministers, who have tried to do something towards redressing some balance. And when we get to Bob Hawke, I thought in my mind, yes, but he cried on his last day, he cried that he wanted to do that. And I was very sharply reminded or shown that those were not tears that I thought they were. Maybe you want to describe that for us, Darren.
Yeah, I think Rachel Perkins is so powerful in that moment. So I guess it's Bob Hawke's lament, isn't it, that he didn't deliver on the Barunga Statement or the treaty, like an opportunity for treaty slipped away again. And these wonderful documents have been created with very good will and generosity and in 2 languages and presented. And then that dream evaporated again, or even that promise really evaporated. I know here when I was younger, hearing Rachel's father, Charlie Perkins, talk about it, I know that's something that Rachel deeply feels. So I think, she says it with such presence and force, I think, when she looks to the camera and she said, and he should cry those tears. And I found that, you can see how that has lived within her family. She carries it forward today. Her campaign about the yes referendum which obviously we all know failed. But I think we did the interview not long after the referendum, and I think you really feel the pain of that when she's talking in that moment.
Yeah, it was a visceral moment. This is an ancient history we're talking about. This is stuff that's still impacting people every single day.
Yes, and it's only like 1990? Oh, no, that's when children were supposed to be out of poverty, wasn't it? But yeah, it was very recent history where Bob Hawke cried, and it appeared, 93, was it? Yeah. Okay, now I want to just ask you, I mean, we'll get to the incredible permissions that you must have gone through in a moment, but what was your idea, Ben, about creating this visually? Because we're getting, as I was mentioning before, contradictions and paradoxes all the time in the ideas, but we're also getting them visually, which is very clever.
It can be interesting to... I love when you hear one thing and you're seeing something else, and the audience is expected then to engage rather than just sit and be fed ideas, that your job is to then think, what are they trying to say with this? And also the line, I think we spoke about earlier on Mark Twain's, that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. That there are all these themes that run through not just the interviews with the academics and the individuals this stuff happened to, but it's through all of our art, through our books, through our films. And so I wanted to just try and draw a line through all of those things to remind us that we're all part of the same culture. And it's not necessarily, if you're talking about Captain Cook, you don't have to see an oil painting from a couple of 100 years ago. You know, there are so many other ways you can tell these stories.
You can
see Michael Cook. You can see Michael Cook, the Aboriginal artist.
Or you have the barbecue area.
Yeah. Yes, the Aboriginal people in landing at first contact and asking the white Australians what they call this area, and of course what's the barbecue area, you know.
I'd say also the other thing is that I'm not a historian. I play the role of the general public, the uneducated in this role. So it's the stuff that occurred to me while reading Julianne's book. This is the lens that I see this stuff through. So I kind of hoped that if I can see it through Kath and Kim or the castle, then maybe other Australians will too.
Julianne, when you were seeing your ideas being transformed like this, was there a sort of a letting go that you had to do?
Oh, yeah, no, I was quite happy to let go. They may not think so, but I was. It was interesting because, as Darren said, I mean, there was quite a long process that led up to getting the funding and getting Ben on board and getting the rest of the team on board. And I think it's fair to say that we went through a number of different iterations of how we might treat it. And so at one stage it was much more traditional history, traditional current affairs. But I remember the first meeting we had with Ben, and Darren had said, I've found the perfect director, you know, he's going to be great. And then I remember the first meeting we had at Blackfella offices in what is the old UTS library, weirdly. And Ben said, well, I've got this idea, and what I'm using as my reference point is, and I'm sure people here, many of you will have seen that film, I'm Not Your Negro, which was based about the James Baldwin work, but then using a lot of pop culture sort of images to really sort of animate and say, well, he might have been writing about the 40s and 50s, but here we are in 2020 and here's the same stuff. So that was one thing. And I mean, we were sort of familiar with the sort of Adam Curtis type stuff as well, of that multi-layering of different pop culture stuff. And I guess from my point of view, there's quite a strong cultural theme all the way through the book. I mean, I talk about books and art and various other films and things, music especially. Music's difficult because it's expensive. So I thought that what Ben was saying absolutely went to the spirit of what I had been trying to do with the book in a way that, you know, I couldn't have imagined, you know. So that was the great gift of that first conversation.
And I think, yeah, Ben, like, you know, all credit and coming up with that idea, because it's a bold idea, but actually, you know, those bold ideas, when someone comes up with them, you quickly test it. And that's what we did. Like, we did a cut of what we thought using old shows that we'd made and interview grabs. And actually, we did that within a week, I think. And we all looked at it and went, God, that's brilliant. That can really work. And so really, you know, that is when, you know, good ideas cut through, because you can mock it up and you can see and you go, this is real potential. And it was terribly exciting. On the other side of that, as the producer who has to think about, in the show itself, there are over 1,800 archival events, as we call them. So every new clip image that has to be licensed. So there's 1,800 of those in the series. And so each one of those has to be clipped, sent to the people that you're getting it from, a license agreement for it. So like the work on that is extraordinary. Also, thank you, SBS, quite costly, but SBS supported the additional cost. But so just to give you an insight into that, those things are quite difficult. And actually some people didn't want to give us their footage, which is interesting in of itself.
Can you tell us anything about that without defaming, I suppose, or revealing the process too much?
Look, I think I can tell a little of the story and people can join the dots. In the mining episode, there was a wonderful clip that we had used, and it was Magda Szubanski pretending to be one of our great mining magnates. And she had a clip where she talked about, and Magda is sitting there with a piece of iron ore, I believe, or a rock, something out of the ground, a giant piece of coal. And she says, and she describes what is in the mine is mine. What's not in the mine will soon be mine, and gives us a very humorous account and a quick précis of what mining is. Yes, some of the rights holders and others thought that might be difficult to use.
Well, it is tricky if you are, potentially causing affront to the 13th richest woman in the world who dines with the President of the United States. Can I just say something? I mean, the effort that Darren and Michelle and Jacob went through in getting the rights and Naomi as well. I mean, the whole group of people who are involved in that absolutely painstaking work is amazing. But I must say that as a writer, it's really interesting. So there are things that I can write, I could describe in great detail. I mean, Darren's story, the mining story is one, but there are a lot of others as well, where I could write in graphic detail what somebody has said that has been broadcast. They've signed all their permissions. It's all been out there. It's probably on social media, floating around in the internet. But to actually put it onto television proves to be impossible. There's sort of contradictions internal in that sort of, in using visual storytelling as a way of getting to a truth when you can't even reproduce something which is already in the public domain is really interesting.
That is really, that I have to say that over the past 5 years has really reduced. When something had been broadcast, you take for granted that it had been on the ABC, been on 7:30, been on Late Line, that you would assume, and which we always have done until very recently, just assume because of its prior publication, broadcast, we could use that within our programs. Now there's an extra layer, and there's an extra layer of anxiety about using those things, where often now we're asked to go back to the person who said the thing and to ask them their permission. So as Julianne says, she could write about something that somebody said on Late Line and describe the event. Now we are being asked to go back to that person. So in a way, I worry that the presentation of that voice, their thought, their idea at that time, and then any kind of then reinterpretation or just, interrogation of that idea and where we've gotten to now will be extremely limited, because we won't be able to play that clip if that person has now decided that their view on that is no longer their view. Now, it was their view at that time. And I think that's where we're in a really worrying place.
It's also, we could have made this for TikTok or for Instagram and used all of these clips without asking for permission for a single one of them and backed it all to Beyonce, and not one copyright holder would have been able to stop us. So I don't understand why in 2025 Australian TV can be so far behind in terms of copyright law.
And in terms of the sort of the understanding of the context of the time. So, I mean, one example which I'll tell, I don't know, people might be offended, but too bad. But one of them was a story involving one of the first exchanges involving Yasmin Abdel-Majid and Jackie Lambie on Q&A, and it was when Jackie Lambie was in her more an earlier phase of Jackie Lambie, shall we say. And she got stuck into Yasmin, screaming at her that she was trying to encourage Sharia law and that she didn't know anything about Islam, and she, just screaming abuse. I mean, that Tony Jones actually had to pull them apart. It was so disgusting. And it set up the frame for Yasmin to become the figure that she was and targeted in the way that she was subsequently.
And she ultimately left Australia and now lives overseas.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah. And still dealing with the trauma of it all. But what Lambie did in that Q&A instance was actually give license for people to behave like that. I mean, I personally felt sort of awful responsibility because Yasmin had first written for me at Griffith Review and we'd got her onto Q&A, and this was like the second time she'd been on there. So she was building a profile and, this was just ugly beyond words. Anyway, so Lambie said she didn't want that to be reused, which fair enough. Her views have changed. She probably realises that was actually stepping over the line in a way that was not appropriate in public life. I mean, we're talking about a world in which John Anderson, the former Deputy Prime Minister, says that we've got to have civility in politics, something which seemed to bypass him when he was Deputy Prime Minister. But anyway, that's an aside. But so we had this situation where Lambie wouldn't allow that to be used. So that meant making the case around the way in which Yasmin was targeted very much harder to create. I mean, we didn't obviously want to re-traumatise Yasmin by using it either. But I just thought it was a great example. Scrub the history. I didn't say that, or if I did say I didn't mean it. The consequences were huge, but it wasn't really me.
So an examination perhaps, or a re-examination of our fair dealing laws might be in order. But it does lead to another part of the story that you all tell, which is about the media more broadly. And you point out that Australians have been historically an incredibly literate country and great devourers of newspapers and media. And there's some fantastic clips of Rupert Murdoch saying it's really important that we have a lot of newspapers in the country, which is sort of great. But now,
that is a fantastic bit of archive.
It is extraordinary. But now there's another threat, and that is fake news, which is something that you can now say about anything that you don't like, and it's legitimised because there is so much fake news about, but also the conspiracy theorists destabilising just some pretty basic ideas about what, is actually happening in factual terms. There's the tech bros, the corporate bodies that seem to be more powerful than governments that aren't keeping up. I mean, what you're actually telling in your story is something that's happening as we're reading it, or as we're watching it. It's a kind of yet another one of your paradoxes, Julianne.
Well, it was interesting. I mean, we did a chunk of stuff. We did a chunk of stuff about censorship and how the old routines of censorship. We start off with the thing about Australia being the most literate country in the world, which apparently was at the beginning of the 20th century, and then we talk about censorship and the constraints on discussion, then a bit about the sort of Murdoch, rise and how that concentration of media ownership has skewed things for a long period of time. And then we come to the section about, well, now more of this control has slipped away because of the sort of, the information environment in which we live. I was really determined that we actually closed that circle and brought it up to that point. Because if you're left with an old Murdoch story, you're not dealing with the reality that we're currently in. And that seems to me to be really important. I mean, the backstories of the rights and so on are, sort of in-house chatter about it, but everyone's dealing with that every day. I mean, the notion of there being the old unifying thing that happens through a nationally controlled media meant that there was a shared national sort of conversation. That's so fragmented now that it's very difficult to actually galvanise. I mean, you've done it with Radio National with your books, the best books of the last century or the last 25 years. You've managed to create a cultural moment with that, but they are very, very rare occurrences because the media ecosystem in which we exist now doesn't actually do that. I mean, we are engaged in a world which is shaped by the United States, populated by Americans, dominated by an American president, and everything that hangs off that. So it's hard.
Oh, you put that beautifully. I guess
that's why she wrote the book and we made the show.
I guess one of the things is extending the question, the offer to people. How do you do that? How do you have a conversation like this, have it continuously? The campfire of television's gone. TikTok, who knows where it's going to be? I mean, is it in, community like we're talking now in a bookshop? Is it about actually face-to-face? Is that like the most radical thing that we can do?
What I would say is that even from 2.5 years ago, the Australian War's coming out to now this show, I think, what you have in a media environment where there are less reviewers because there's not the appointment viewing. So there's not the ticking calendar of this is coming out next week. Like if you look and I was interested, I've been observing this for a while, but it really crystallized and the idea of Australia being launched. Reviewers would often say these shows are coming out this week. Now, that is done in a very small degree, right, in those lift outs that are still in the Sunday papers. But actually, if you're not engaging with that, which, as we know, they are on decline, if you're not engaging with that, you're not finding out about shows. Now, reviewers now write about 5 shows that I've watched over the last 6 months that I thought, or 2 shows that I've rewatched, that was made in 1997, like Sex and the City. So I think what you're seeing now is how do people in this noisy environment, and this is the challenge for, I think, all of us, is how do you get these shows which would have the water cooler moment, which people would be talking about? I think that is becoming increasingly harder. I think that moment has passed, and I don't know what the new moment for that is because the algorithm will not get you to see what you don't want to see.
One of the other things about that is that, and it's about the diminution of reviewing culture more generally, whether it's for books or theatre or music or whatever, is that there's so little space and it's so, it has become so impressionistic, what I would have done, what I think about this. You get a glimmer from what Ben and Darren have been saying tonight about the sort of the craft and the discipline of making documentary television that they've been engaged with in making these programs. Now, I want a reviewer to actually engage with the whole complexity of what's involved in that, in making an assessment, not just of what historian A or historian B may have said, but with how it's presented as a whole. And that, you need more space to do that. You need really informed critics to do it. But it's about the crafting of the storytelling. That's how these things advance. Something gets made and then that becomes a benchmark for something else. Otherwise, you're stuck spinning your wheels doing the same stuff over and over.
Is it more events like this? I'm the chair of the Sydney Film Festival. The festival has had its biggest selling year ever, which was the last festival just on. And the largest growth is that 18 to 35 year age group. And the shows, the screenings they come to is when the filmmakers are there and there's discussions. And it's interesting and kind of heartening in a world where a lot of that conversation is going. But actually, that communing being together, as you said, community coming together, actually seems to have struck a chord and is more valued than ever.
And that's the same with the Sydney Writers' Festival as well. This last year is their best year ever by a mile.
Who knew? We actually like getting together and looking each other in the eye and talking about things and maybe even having our opinions changed.
Yeah.
Incredible. I don't know if we have any. Oh, we do have a question up the back here. Is that?
Yeah, just
you want to take one?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, sorry. And I'm wondering if it's possible to talk about periods of time in Australia when the ideas we had about Australia were really muscular and strong and morally clear and ambitious, to kind of the ideas about Australia today, which strike me as pretty pedestrian, pretty kind of pathetic, really. There's not much in them, there's not much left, and it feels like the tanks run dry on both ideas and imagination. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on that.
Look, I think that's really, if anything, that's one of the reasons we tell stories about where good things happened, whether it's about the sort of, there's a whole bunch of things we've told which are good stories about the past of Australia. Part of the reason for doing that sort of in the structure of what we were doing and aiming to do was to say to people now, don't say it's too hard. Really hard things have happened in the past and they can happen again. And I think that we've lost sight of that. People just say, oh, there's no money. Oh, you can't do that. It's too hard, blah, blah, America, blah, whatever the line of the day is. And it seems to me part of what we're trying to do with this is to say to people, look, there have been periods when really big things have happened, and that has set a tone which has lasted for a long time. Some of Tony's stuff about the sort of colonial the radical colonial period. Absolutely, there are echoes of that we can pick up on for now. One of the examples that I think is just massively underdone is the whole lead up to Federation. And I've sat in rooms with Federation scholars who tell me, oh, it's so boring. Really, there's nothing much we can say about this. It's so boring. Really, it's about these grey beards, blah, 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 boring. And you don't have to delve very far into Trove to read the debates that were happening in local papers all around the place, about, what sort of society they wanted to create. And they were very radically divergent sorts of views. Now, what we get after 2 referendums in each of the colonies over 12 years and then 3 months of negotiation to water the constitution down in the UK is something which is sort of an approximation almost of some of the stuff that was around. But none of the vibrancy that was around in that period in terms of arguing what the place might be, it's just been forgotten. So the celebration, the 50th anniversary of Federation, which had been planned by the Labor government before Menzies came in, was due to be an effort at reviving some of that stuff at the time. And then Menzies come in and says, well, no, what we're going to do is we're going to have an address from the King, and I think one of the researchers spent ages trying to get the address from the King, which was the primary event of the 50th anniversary of Federation. Then Keating tried to do the same thing leading up to the centenary, and there were some really bold things happened. There was a big replica of the Bathurst Convention that was held in Bathurst, chaired by Gordon Samuel, who was governor at the time, funded by AMP, which was still a mutual, and they came up with this amazing agenda of how the Australian Constitution should be updated. Well, Howard gets in, abolishes that, sets up a bunch of constitutional conventions, which I think came up with COAG as the single biggest outtake of what was going to be, puts Donald MacDonald in as chair of the centenary of Federation. What do? The first event is held in the Guildhall in London. For Christ's sake, talk about not owning the vibrancy of what was around to just, wash that stuff away. So I just hope that by just reminding people of some of those periods which were muscular, as you say, that it just gives people a bit more confidence to think that maybe they can do it again.
You illustrate very beautifully the knowledge of Federation in one part of your television series. Who would like to just briefly describe that? That is fantastic.
Oh, we just did a quick vox pops around the centenary of Federation Monument in Centennial Park, thinking that we'd have to ask many, many people to find enough people who knew nothing about it to give us what we needed for the scene. And as it turned out, not one person, I don't think, that we spoke to had any idea what it was. It's basically the backdrop for a dog park now. And it was astounding. And I count myself as someone who's walked past that a million times and never realised what it was for.
I was saying I did like the shot of the dog that Ben put in.
Perfect visual.
But what was it? But on a serious, it is. It's designed to be mysterious. The Centennial Park Trust describes it as a mysterious building. How you can have a memorial to Federation and describe it as a mysterious building is just sort of like bizarre. Anyway, but what was most astonishing about that? I think you must have interviewed about 20 people. Just trying to get make sure that you weren't misrepresenting the level of knowledge that was available. We all know that the polls show that the surveys show that 50% of the population knows nothing about civics. Well, that was proven.
That's just in Parliament too.
And that was proven. This was less than a year after the referendum, and we asked people whether they knew that Australia had a constitution. Oh no, never thought about that. Suppose you'd have to find some way of regulating the states. God help us. This is in the richest, most educated part of Australia. And they didn't have a clue.
Well, look, before I get into more trouble in terms of editorial policies, we better have a chance to talk to you and to buy your book and to also join us for a drink of wine. Thank you very much